This is a Sports Catastrophe production.
Hey there, Heather Ho there. It's Jeff Cutter welcoming you to another Sports Catastrophe on this day. And on this day, December 5th, 1998, it's the big day. Who will get into the first ever BCS championship game? Now, the national championship picture was kind of cloudy and all of that for many years, way back when. Before 1993, the national championship game between a number one and a number two seemed impossible because of the simple fact that certain bowls had conference tie-ins. The Rose Bowl is the biggest example, as the Pac-12 champion would take on the Big Ten champion, no matter what ranking they were at the start of the year. I mean, by the time the bowl happened, you had the Sugar Bowl that brought a few tie-ins. The Orange Bowl had the tie-in with the Big Eight, soon to be the Big 12, against the team. The ACC didn't really have much of. I think it was the ACC and the Orange Bowl. I can't remember the tie-in. And you had the Fiesta Bowl, which brought two teams that were not tied down to anything. And you had the Cotton Bowl, which had the Southwest Conference champion taking on another team. Probably the SEC champion. Regardless, it was huge and all that. One such example of the 1-2 game actually perfectly playing out was 1987 when Miami and Penn State were facing each other for the national title in Tempe, making the Fiesta Bowl actually credible in everyone's eyes because Miami and Penn State both were not tied to a conference. They were independents. Miami would soon join the ACC in 1991, and Penn State would join the Big Ten in 1993. So anyhow, the Big Ten was ready to go. So then in 92, they decided to have certain bowls take place and certain numbers taking on each other. Florida State and Nebraska won in the de facto national championship game in 1994 after that and saw Florida State winning a title. And after a few years of the bowl correlation / alliance, they moved to the bowl championship series using computer rankings and, certain bowls doing certain games. They would rotate between four major sites, the Fiesta Bowl, the Rose Bowl, the Sugar Bowl, and the Orange Bowl, to be the national championship game. The poor Cotton Bowl, got bit and didn't get one of those things. So it would be a rotation every 4 years. One of those four stadiums would host the national championship game. The only problem was, the national championship game. They decided the national championship game alongside the bowl for a while. So sometimes there would be two games at the Rose Bowl and the national championship game. But that was later on, past 2004, I think. In this iteration, the 98 iteration, it was the four major bowls. Well, of course, Cotton Bowl, not really major, would host. And then at the Fiesta Bowl in Tempe, Arizona, would be the national championship game. The Fiesta Bowl. The problem with things like the Rose Bowl in 2002 was that, for example, is that the Rose Bowl wasn't on January 1 when it could have been, when it usually is. But regardless, that's what happened. So, December 5th, 1998, two games would actually lead to a BCS crowding. It's number one Tennessee was in the championship. Tennessee looked good. They won the SEC title. They were going to the BCS national championship game. But the question is who their opponent would be. The first of two games was 98 when UCLA took on Miami at the Orange Bowl, home to the Miami Hurricanes. UCLA looked like they were going to be in the Fiesta Bowl with a victory for the BCS national championship. So it would be the Bruins versus the Vols and all that. It was huge. UCLA had a 20-game winning streak dating back to the previous season and were the Pac-10 champs after being 8-0 in conference play. UCLA not really known for their prominence on the national scene. They had a national championship in 1954, but that was way long ago. The Hurricanes had Butch Davis. Miami was 7-3. Not really much of a thing and all that. Actually, the reason why this regular season game was December 98 was for one reason. Because of Hurricane George. The threat was that the threat of the hurricane had both schools had to postpone the game. So they basically had to move it to December. Miami had been crushed by Syracuse 66-13 in a game in Miami known as Route 66. And Miami had a chance to win the Big East championship. I said ACC, I'm sorry. Miami was Big East. Anyway. There was a wristband issue, but anyway, it didn't matter. So Miami looked pretty good and all that. They were up 21-17. It was a high-scoring game. ESPN had that game. But UCLA would put up 3 straight touchdowns, make it 38-21. And UCLA had a 45-42 lead with 3:34 left. All they had to do was run down the clock, and they were headed to the national title game. They had a 3rd and 8 on their 44. Cade McDowell passed to Brad Melsby. He was tackled at the 26-yard line. However, he fumbled the ball and Miami recovered. And the replay said that Melsby was down at the 26, so that meant that they could run the clock down or at worst kick a field goal. Unfortunately, with no instant replay in college football, they couldn't do anything about it. They couldn't reverse it. Miami drove down the field with 50 seconds left, scored the winning touchdown. And Miami would win 49-45. Edgerrin James put up 299 yards, which was a Miami and Big East record. UCLA was upset. Of course, Cade McDowell was a decent quarterback, but, this team, Miami would taunt them with Rose Bowl chants. Now, a lot of people would be thinking, hey, the Rose Bowl is not that bad of a stadium and all that, and it's not that bad of a game. It's a granddaddy of the all. But UCLA was had a disappointing season. I mean, after all, they could have won for the national title game. They would go to the Rose Bowl. They actually knew the stadium well because, that's UCLA's home field. So home field advantage. Not so fast. Wisconsin won 30-31. And UCLA has not played in any of the Big 6 college football games. That's Sugar, Orange, Rose, Fiesta, Cotton, or Peach/Chick-fil-A, as they call it, since. Arizona looked like they were going to the Rose Bowl. With UCLA's win, Arizona would be going to the Rose Bowl to take on Wisconsin, not UCLA. But they had to go to the Holiday Bowl. But the good news for the Wildcats was that they won the game 23-20. So Florida State would be itching for things. And a lot of people said that Miami's win over UCLA brought Miami back to respectability after a few seasons of terrible shit. But the day was not done. Oh, no. We're not talking about one game. We're talking about 2 games. So Kansas State, yes, Kansas State, for all their crappiness in the 1980s and early 90s, they had a chance to win not only the Big 12 championship, but to win a trip to the national title game against Tennessee. So anyway, Kansas State looked huge. They were 11-0. They were perfect in Big 12 play. Texas A&M were their opponents, 10-2 with a 7-1 mark conference play, and they were number 8 by the BCS. So this was huge. 2 top 10 teams facing each other. Kansas State saw that UCLA lost, so that meant they could move on to the national title game. A&M lost to Texas just earlier, but anyway, it was huge. Texas A&M were down 27-12 in the 4th quarter, and it looked like Kansas State was going to win this game, go to the national title game, and be happy. In fact, it was amazing. Well, Kansas State looked good with Michael Bishop, future CFL legend, being 8 for 8 with 159 yards and 2 touchdowns. But the second half was a different story. That Nguyen put up 17 tackles, the most in Big 12 championship history. Jamar Toombs had a touchdown run. Brandon Stewart surprised a lot of people. And in overtime, both teams would kick a field goal. Well, in the NCAA at the time, you get a possession at the 25-yard line. If you score a touchdown, the other team had to score a touchdown, or else game over. If you score a field goal and the other team scored a touchdown, you lose. But if you score a field goal and they score a field goal, the game goes on. And if it goes to 3 overtimes, at that time, you have to go for, if you score a touchdown, you have to go for 2. Nowadays, you go for 2-point conversions after the third overtime. Kind of pathetic. But anyway, in the second overtime, Kansas State kicked a field goal. But then Sir Parker made a great catch and eluded a tackler to score in double overtime. And A&M wins 36-33. Kansas State's chances for the national championship go up in smoke. And Florida State, of all teams, got lucky, and they got to the national title game. And all that. This was amazing. The Big 12 championship. Kansas State and UCLA, schools that really didn't have much of a college football history, unless you go way back in the 50s and 60s, were out. Florida State would go on to the national title game, but lose in a touchdown to Tennessee, who surprisingly, that was the first season after Peyton Manning left for the NFL. They won the national title game. The first BCS title ever. So anyway, Texas A&M would go on to win the game in double overtime. Well, won in double overtime. Got to the Sugar Bowl, but got crushed by Ohio State 24-14. So Ohio State looked like they were going to probably win the national title game. But no, Kansas State had to play in the Alamo Bowl, losing to Drew Brees and the Purdue Boilermakers 37-34. So that wasn't good and all that. The BCS had its big moments trying to get into the national title game. So it was just shithousery, if you will. Now, to be fair, I mean, this wasn't the last time BCS would be under fire, especially in 2004 when USC, Auburn, and LSU all had serial losses. And people just didn't know who to have the national title game and who would fall to a major bowl. But, times are changing. So anyway, the BCS would soon turn into the college football playoff for the 2014 season. It's just like that. Who says college football isn't exciting? It sure is. Anyway, I'm Jeff Diamond.